Welcome everybody to tonight's webinar. My name is Chris Jagazia, and I'm going to be presenting you James Haywood, who is a ESL content writer here at Off to Class, and he is the man behind our very large phrasal verbs section, and multi-word verbs is what he's going to talk to you about tonight. And I'll pass it over to James.
Okay, well, I'll say good morning. I know there are a couple of other people who are on in a very similar time zone to me, and it's great to see people right across the world joining us. So either good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. As Chris mentioned, I'm an ESL teacher, and I'm doing the content writing for Off to Class. The last 6 months, I've been looking deeply into my own teaching skills around what are either called phrasal verbs or multi-word verbs. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing my teaching experience with you this morning. So what I'll do just very briefly is run through what we'll talk about, obviously a couple of aims of the webinar, what your goal should be as a teacher, a very quick definition of what is a phrasal verb. It can sometimes be a little bit contentious whether you call them phrasal or multi-word verbs, but we'll go through that. And then what I think you need to know as a teacher to teach effectively. Probably the most important thing are the grammatical terms that you really need to be comfortable with, because some of those your students will also need to know. Secondly, there are a series of what are called syntactic and semantic tests. Don't be frightened by the terminology. It's really just a test for you to understand which group a particular verb belongs to. And I think it really helps if you are teaching phrasal verbs to upper, intermediate, and advanced students, that you have an understanding. So essentially that you can answer the questions because different phrasal verbs have different grammatical properties, and you don't want to be giving a student the answer that it's English, it's just like that. So I really want to help you go past that. Some of you probably already are very experienced at teaching phrasal verbs and perhaps are listening to just get a different perspective on it. So as Chris mentioned, we have a Q&A. If there's something you don't agree with or that you would like me to clarify, feel very free to voice your opinion and answer your question on the QA as we go through. And at the end, hopefully I'll have some time to answer those for you. Number 5, what a student, I think, needs to learn proficiently. And when I say proficiently, I believe that students need to use a dictionary correctly. It's probably the most important thing that they need to do in order to be able to continue using phrasal verbs with self-study, because most of their lives the teacher won't be around, and it's really important that you as the teacher impart that understanding that a student needs to feel comfortable using a dictionary, and in what way a phrasal verb is presented that already shows them how that they can and can't use the phrasal verb. Finally, we'll go through the materials that I use to teach online and also in my in-person classes. Most of these are lesson plans that I have developed myself. Obviously, there's no push for you to use them, but it has worked for me and helped me advance in my teaching methodology there. So what I'll go through first are the aims. Obviously, I'm going to teach you the grammar required to teach phrasal or multi-word verbs effectively to your students, and then I'll simply be showing you some ways in which you can teach that. So I've kept the aims quite simple. Hopefully we'll reach those. All right, so your goal as a teacher, obviously, it kind of goes without saying, you want the student to feel comfortable. That is the ultimate goal, is the student feels comfortable and empowered to use grammatical terms that are associated with different properties that go with different phrasal verbs. If you take a phrasal verb like to run into and bump into, and a phrasal verb like to take something off, they have very different ways in which they can and can't be used. The second thing, as I've already mentioned, you do want your student to use a dictionary correctly, and it's something I always reinforce. Even when I teach online, I often ask my students to have a dictionary on hand so that they can physically do some work in front of me. Obviously, it's a kinesthetic way of learning, and as much as they like to be looking at the screen if you're teaching online, a dictionary is extremely effective with phrasal verbs. I'll go into that in a minute. So first of all right, what is a multi-word verb? Okay, I've already myself used the word phrasal verb and multi-word verb. But essentially, a multi-word verb in English is a combination of a word and one or two other elements. Now, a lot of people will say that it's a combination of a word and a preposition. I don't like that definition because although something looks like a preposition, in this case, it really doesn't always act as a preposition. And one of the slides that I've taken from my introductory lesson that I use with my students into phrasal verbs is to just get them thinking about what is and isn't and what can look like a phrasal verb in English. And if you look at the examples that I've given in front of you, there are 5. He looked at the cat, looked up, another version of looked up, and then the final one that you've got here is actually number 4 is Adam is looking up the tree. And most students won't understand, and even some teachers, here, up is not part of the verb. It's a pure preposition, and it is not a phrasal verb. And this, as you can imagine, as for non-native English speakers, they fail to understand the difference between this sentence, and this sentence, or they will find them confusing. So this goes back to my idea of think of a multi-word or a phrasal word verb as a verb and one or two other elements. But in the first instance, don't call it a preposition or an adverb. Okay, so next I'm going to go into the 3 main groups that multi-word verbs belong to. One is the largest group, phrasal verbs. And in some grammar books, you will never see the second or the third category. In fact, some people equate phrasal verbs with all multi-word verbs. I don't use this definition because at higher levels, I believe there is a distinct group of phrasal verbs, prepositional verbs, and prepositional phrasal verbs. And all of these form part together of multi-word verbs. If you have a look at the verbs that we've got on the screen, most of them are quite commonly used, and they are verbs that I would introduce to a student in the first 10 or 12 lessons that I would have with that student. So if you look at the first group, you can see here, look up. It's an extremely common phrasal verb. We use it in both spoken and written English, and it's what's called a separable transitive phrasal verb. In the same group, we've got something called run into, which is known as an inseparable transitive phrasal verb. And I'll go into those properties of the phrasal verb group after this. Now, prepositional verbs and prepositional phrasal verbs will actually go beyond the scope of what I'm planning to teach you today. But time permitting, I will continue on with that because, again, they do go together from a teacher's point of view. So, going back to my definition about a multi-word verb is a verb and an element, what that element is called in grammatical terms is a particle. It's not an adverb or a preposition, but it does have the same form. And so if you look at the 2 sentences we've got here, I'd probably bring this sentence in about lesson 3 or 4. You've got 2 fairly standard sentences in English. I decided on the chair, and I decided on the chair. Both look exactly the same. But for native speakers, you will probably already see that there is a difference in the context. If you are using decided on as a multi-word verb, then you've got a particle here. And the chair is the direct object in the sentence. If you have here, I decided as your verb and on the chair, then you have a preposition, as in I made the decision on the chair. I'm going to come back to the use or the difference, the distinction between prepositions and particles as we go along. But what you do need to know is that when you have a verb which has a preposition, you can do the following sentences in English. And these are what are called syntactic and semantic texts. For example, all of these are very acceptable forms of English, and indeed they're required forms of English in academic and written English. However, you can't use these if the element is a particle. It only works if you're talking about a true preposition. So that's one reason I refer to multi-word, well, it's the main reason I refer to multi-word verbs as having a verb and a particle. Try to avoid preposition where you can. This is something that is really important for teachers. You will always get the question, why, for example, can I say I looked the word up, but I can't say I ran him into. You always have to say I ran into him. And I'm going to go through the different groups with their different grammatical properties. First of all, you have transitive or intransitive verbs, and you really need to understand as a teacher the difference between a verb that can take a direct object and a verb that won't take a direct object. He sat on the chair, it's an obvious one. The chair is the direct object. I died, there's no direct object. It's really important. If you undertake phrasal verbs, your student really needs to understand. It's the most basic thing. A student needs to understand what a direct object is. Next, we've got separable or inseparable verbs, and there are rules around how a phrasal verb can be separated by a pronoun, and I'll go into that as well. Next, there's something called the relative clause test. I probably won't cover that in this webinar. It's related to using prepositions only and not articles within relative clauses, but it's something that you can look up, and again, it is mostly used in academic English. Another thing that is similar to section C is the WH question test. The reason that we can say, on which chair did you sit, okay, but we can't say, on which hat did you put, all right? So that's the WH question test. And finally, the particle movement test. So I'll run through that also. Another thing that you need to be really aware of as a teacher is when you teach multi-word verbs and a student uses the dictionary, you are going to need to guide them in the first instances, because in English, not only do verbs have different meanings, but multi-word verbs really do have multiple meanings. And not only do they have multiple meanings, but the same form of a phrasal verb, such as take off, can belong to very different groups and therefore have different properties. If we have a look, for example, at take off, when talking about fly, this verb never takes a direct object. The plane took off. If you look at another one here, another intransitive use of take off, he took off without saying anything. Again, there is no direct object. Here, you have take something off, and I'm sorry, that's also intransitive. It's John's career is taking off. Again, succeed, no direct object. But here is one of the more common uses of take off, and you've got to take something off. Now, I've got the direct object in brackets between the verb and the particle, and it's in brackets because in English, the direct object can appear between the verb and the particle, or also after the verb and particle. But there is a tighter distinction to that rule. If the direct object is a pronoun, you can say Sonia took off her earrings. Sonia took her earrings off, but you must say Sonia took them off. You cannot say Sonia took off them. And that's one of the really important discussions, that your student needs to understand some of these rules to enable them to use phrasal verbs correctly from the time that they start to learn them with you. And finally, another meaning of take something off. Again, it belongs to the same group of grammatical properties, but it's to not work. So we take time off. So you can see here again, before you launch into teaching phrasal verbs, always remember that when you refer a student to a dictionary, they are going to come up against meanings that are in conflict with what you've just explained, and that can be quite confusing for them if they haven't yet learned the different categories. So one thing that I'm going to point on is that a lot of teachers feel that phrasal verbs are only preferred in informal discourse or spoken English. My answer is to that, so what? Your students want to learn English, and they want more than anything to be able to speak. It's really important, and there isn't actually a lot of academic proof. I think it's just, I don't know why there is this belief, but even as of 2008, there is actually no documented preference. It's just one of these urban myths that exist amongst English teachers, in my opinion, that phrasal verbs are preferred in informal discourse. There is a group that certainly we find more in spoken English and in fiction, and I'll go through those. But on the whole, the quantitative data that is available shows that phrasal verbs are used just as much in written English as they are in spoken English. And so the only other thing I'll comment there is that phrasal verbs in the last 100, 200 years have really started to increase in number. And in fact, a lot of the new verbs and the meanings that enter the language are phrasal verbs. So keep these in mind. For me, they are an incredibly important part of the language to teach. It's up to you when you start teaching them, but they are very important. So that's all I'll say on those. Okay, I've already talked about a good dictionary is vital, and I really believe this because you want to empower the student to go on and study while you're not there. Now, this is a slide that is actually in one of my lesson plans, and so I actually pull the dictionary out at this point. I have the student also get the dictionary, look at the main verb in the dictionary, and then you need to ask them to start having a look at the phrasal verbs or multi-word verbs, which always come after the main verb in the dictionary. Get them to understand how and feel comfortable, excuse me, you want the student to feel comfortable with how these verbs are presented in the dictionary, and you can see that they are separable transitive phrasal verbs in this point, which again I will explain to you, because the direct object appears between the verb and the particle. Okay, so here's the rule around direct objects. If you're dealing with separable transitive phrasal verb group, you have to place it between the verb and the particle. Here, to put something on is the phrasal verb, the direct object is hat, and if you change that direct object to a pronoun, it must go between the verb and the particle. Now, this is true only for separable transitive phrasal verbs, but it's the first real grammar rule that I teach students. I need them to understand what a direct object is and how when it becomes a pronoun in English, it is placed in this position. So moving on from there, I'm actually going to take you online now and into one of the lessons that I have on inseparable intransitive phrasal verbs. So here we looked up, you can see the screen. You're now in our website, which has the lesson content, which is called After Class. I won't run through the functionality, but I use all of these materials to teach my students. I'll also mention that the annotations that I'm using to draw on screen, they actually come with the Zoom video conference system that we're using. And I guess not to labor the point, obviously they're extremely helpful because I can guide your eyes as to where I want you to look at the screen at any point in time. I can also use them if I need to draw very quickly. I want to reduce my teacher talk time, for example. I can simply draw something that a student's struggling to say, or I can simply just draw it if they're hesitating to find a word. It's very easy to draw it on the screen and allow them, it empowers them a lot to use it. So I use annotations a lot when I'm teaching online using Zoom. So going through the lesson, I get them thinking, This is a similar setup with all of our lessons. This is the introductory lesson that I have, although I'm a few slides in. And essentially, we get them to start doing some self-discovery. Here, I'd probably just get them to read, and they may or may not be familiar with the meanings here. But again, I've highlighted the text of the phrasal verb in a different color, and then we can start thinking about direct objects as we go along and meanings within the sentence. All of the sentences we have, all of the verbs that we introduce will then be brought into a context where they can start to concept check themselves, try to find the meaning within the verbs. So here, for example, I would ask the student to read the sentence and then to find a phrasal verb on the right-hand side, which would actually assist them to understand the meaning of that verb. And so once you've done that for all of those on the slide, you can even stop here, because it's very common when you start with this particular lesson, for example, that students will have had some exposure to phrasal verbs in English anyway, and in fact that's usually why they want to really learn them, is they're not quite understanding. So I've used very common, well, I believe very common phrasal verbs in the first lesson for students who are already studying, and they can probably guess the meaning by looking at the context on the left. So before you would proceed any further in the lesson, ask the student then to start making their own sentences. It doesn't matter if they make mistakes with the grammar, but get them to use these same phrasal verbs in a different context, because it's not always clear how a phrasal verb can be used. Some of them are similar to, for example, picked out is a verb that might be similar to pick, but pick out definitely has the meaning of select, and it is different. So you can get them to start practicing these as much as you can before moving through the slides. Then I'll do something here, will actually be a definition. Usually it's a simplified definition if possible. And then we can move on and start doing gap fills. Now, I know a lot of teachers don't enjoy gap fill, and there are people who believe that they are in fact detrimental. I find them valuable because they give a context that most students feel very comfortable with. The reality is that most students around the world will still always have been exposed to closed activities, and it really doesn't hurt to actually use these. And then once they have used them, why not start asking the student to repeat sentence 6, but do it in the negative form? Or perhaps if they're good at verb tenses, you could also ask them to put that into, okay, let's do it into the present perfect. Let's do it into the negative present perfect. And you can really get them to start practicing and feeling the malleability of the language as they go through. You could also ask them, for example, to match the image. We always have lots of visuals on the screen. And then, of course, the ultimate is to get them to use that verb in their own sentence, because you've got an image. So why not ask the student to use the language and the image and make the sentence about the most interesting person in the room themselves? And that obviously brings it back to how you want the students to be able to use the language. So I've gone through there, given some more examples about how the verb can be used. So the next thing I want to show you is probably what's called the particle movement rule. And let me just go through, I will, okay. So here I introduced the concept of transitive verbs. They always take a direct object. And this is a really important thing that students need to know with the first group of separable transitive phrasal verbs, is that they will always take a direct object. This sentence is simply wrong. And for many languages around the world, you do not always need a direct object if it's understood in the context of the sentence. I know this is true for the Turkish students whom I teach. They always get this wrong, and I'm familiar with a couple of other languages where direct objects are not required in the context if it's been understood previously, And so this is where students often go wrong when they first start to use phrasal verbs. It has to be, I handed in the paper, or if that changes to a pronoun, it will have to become, I handed it in. Okay, and that goes again between the verb and the particle. Let me come back a second to my presentation. This is a nice slide to actually start practicing the phrasal verbs with. Once you've introduced the phrasal verb, you need to start giving them some context around which they can start to use those sentences. So once I've done a gap fill, you could ask them, for example, things that you can turn over, do the matching exercise, and then you might ask them then to actually start forming some sentences of their own. You've given them language, it's controlled within a context, and they can really start to tell you that they could look up somebody's address or turn over a piece of meat or put on a hat and check out a friend's new house. And this slide, if you use it well, for example, you only need limited and well thought out selected language that the student can then really get into practicing using the phrasal verbs. And of course, practice is vitally important. Now, once you've gone through separable transitive verbs, the next ones you need to look at are inseparable transitive phrasal verbs. And what happens here is that the direct object in all of these sentences has a different rule. The direct object can never appear, unlike separable transitive phrasal verbs. Inseparable transitive phrasal verbs do not have the particle movement rule. And so the direct object, for example, in this sentence here, can never move from its current position. I ran across that guy, never I ran that guy across, and even when it becomes a pronoun, once that guy changes to him, most of you understand immediately that it's I ran across him and not I ran him across. And this is the largest problem that students will have when they undertake phrasal verbs, is that the difference between verbs that are separable, such as look up, and verbs that are inseparable, such as these on the page, have a very distinct rule when it comes to using the direct object as a pronoun. And we've got loads of activities. I think the first 5 lessons that we cover in our series is all about separable and inseparable transitive phrasal verbs. They all take a direct object, but they don't necessarily take the particle movement rule, which allows you to move the particle here, or as I tell my students, the direct object in between the verb and the particle. So after you've done those 2 groups, we've got separable transitive phrasal verbs and inseparable transitive phrasal verbs. You have another smaller group of transitive phrasal verbs that are called permanently separated verbs. This series, it's usually a bit of a tongue twister for the students to learn, but we use these a lot in English. You can have a look at the verbs that I introduce at the start up here. In most instances, students have seen the first 3 at the top, and see something through I usually teach, because students, for example, see something through works well with any homework or assignments that they might currently have to do. So here, the rule again is about the direct object, and that it comes permanently between the verb and the particle. It seems so natural for native speakers, and probably even for non-native speakers who teach English at an advanced level, that we've almost forgotten the rule ourselves. But you can never say this in English. So that's a good example of using permanently separated transitive phrasal verbs. The next group of verbs that you then need to go into are the intransitive phrasal verbs. These form an enormous portion of the multi-word verbs in English. They are hugely important, and again, because they're intransitive, they do not take a direct object. And when I introduce these to a student, I bring in some examples that I hope by this time are not necessarily highly evident. The meaning is not highly evident. They have to think a little bit. But for example, a lot of students never quite get explode, where in English, it's rare that we use it in speech. We almost always say blow up, so they get it. But again, point out that they do not have direct objects, and you can start doing the comparison between your separable transitive phrasal verbs, inseparable transitive phrasal verbs, permanently separated transitive phrasal verbs, and the intransitive phrasal verbs. So I'm actually going to go into this lesson to show you the intransitive phrasal verbs. Just bear with me one moment, and I'll bring you back here. Now, you're back in the website of the class now, so I'm just going to close the classroom. It would normally ask me, it's going to take me back to the teacher's page. If you do come in, oh, okay, right, that's vaguely embarrassing, it was a little bit slow. So I'll bring in the intransitive phrasal verb lesson here. If you do want to come in, you can have a look around and try some of the lessons that we've got to see what you think, but I'll just bring that up. And now, as I mentioned, intransitive phrasal verbs are a very large group. So before I introduce the idea, I bring up verbs that have been introduced in the previous lesson, and here we have an inseparable transitive phrasal verb, direct object. A permanently separated transitive phrasal verb, okay, the direct object here is a pronoun, and here we have a separable transitive phrasal verb with a direct object that could also appear here. So I ask students to practice these three forms of transitive phrasal verbs before we move into the intransitive phrasal verbs. Again, I go over the direct object to ensure they know where it appears in these sentences. And then, of course, I bring in rules, and finally, the sentences that do not contain the direct object. And this starts to help them to think about the difference between transitive and intransitive, and they need to grasp that as well. A lot of these here, prepositional phrases, will actually confuse the students at first. So again, as a teacher, you will want to be careful and make sure that you understand what is and isn't the direct object in these circumstances. So here we introduce that the phrasal verbs don't have a direct object. And then, as I said, we go into examples, give some more clarification, and then eventually I will give them a referral back to the dictionary that will show for the first time that this is intransitive and phrasal. This is a separable transitive phrasal verb. And this is also a separable transitive phrasal verb. The direct object appears, and it appears in brackets between the verb and the particle. Here, there is no direct object, therefore it is an intransitive phrasal verb. Again, it highlights the use of the dictionary and the importance for a student. So I showed you before a very similar slide with separable transitive phrasal verbs, and here we have the intransitive ones. It's very easy if you want to point out that there is no direct object in any, of these verbs. Okay, again, we bring up some more gap fills. They're very good for students to practice when they can. At this point, you will have introduced 4 different groups of phrasal verbs, so you really want to start getting the student to become elastic with the language. Here, I would not stop at just the gap fill. I would ask them to describe another situation, put the verb into the negative, use different verb tenses, ask a verb about themselves, and use this slide as much as you can as a strong adaptive teacher to get the student using the language. There are also some scenarios that we start to set up where we don't actually, it's a less controlled activity. I guess freer practice is the terminology that's used. And you can see here, for example, that we provide a scenario and there's a question, and the student simply uses that verb and the word changes the words to describe the scenario in another way. I find these quite good. They set up a very short and simple task, and you can then move on from there. You know, could they give you another scenario in which this phrasal verb could be used? So there's good practice there. Okay, I think that's probably enough on intransitive phrasal verbs. I'm going to come back to the presentation for a moment. Right, so we've gone through that. Now, I'll just have a quick look at how we're going with time here. Okay, I think we're, Chris, is it okay if I keep going?
Yep, yeah, you can go till about quarter after. And then maybe 15 minutes for QA. Okay, sure. All right, well, in that case, I'm going to just mention a couple of things to you for a second. One of the things you might be asking as a teacher, or that you feel very comfortable with, are the books that, as a teacher, that will assist you to teach phrasal verbs. I guess a lot of people are going to be very familiar already with English grammar and use. Every student and almost every teacher learning English as a second language around the world will come across this book at some point in their teaching or student career. Unfortunately, as much as I love Raymond Murphy when I need to use the book, I don't find it good for teaching phrasal verbs. It's my personal opinion. It's the least well presented of the grammar points in his books. And although I admire almost everything else he does, I don't recommend Raymond Murphy for teaching phrasal verbs. If you get, I'm not sure if this one's available everywhere, but two things I really like about it is it's printed on recycled paper, and secondly, it's reasonably cheap to purchase in most countries. This is the Barron series, and it's called the Ultimate Phrasal Verb Book. It covers around 480 phrasal verbs that are used in common speech. I feel, but I can't say for certain, that a lot of these verbs are perhaps used in North America and perhaps not in British English. But you know what? It doesn't hurt the student to be going through those anyway. You really want any student who is learning English as a second language to be exposed to all types of Englishes. You don't want to impose at any point one particular English on a student who's learning in 2015. They need to have exposure to different verbs. So I find this one very good, not only for going through if you want to work through with a book, but it's really good for self-study. However, the only thing it doesn't do is it doesn't go strongly into the grammatical properties of the verbs, but it does cover verbs when they're used with modals, when they're used in question forms, and when they're used in different tenses, and that's quite interesting. So I think that's a good self-study one. And finally, as a teacher, I recommend this particular book, especially for its explanation of multi-word verbs. It's The Teacher's Grammar of English by Ron Cowan. It dates, I believe, from 2008. And I find its explanation for you, not for your students, but for you as a teacher, for people who are already experienced teachers at phrasal verbs, they may find the adjustment frustrating to some of the grammar terminology used. However, if you're open-minded and willing to look at things a different way, for me, this did actually revolutionize the way I teach. And you could also say, well, you know, has it improved your students' learning of English? I would say yes, firstly, because I feel more comfortable teaching more advanced levels of English using phrasal verbs. But secondly, because I actually record my students online, I've been able to go back, and although I have not done a quantitative study of my students, I feel very comfortable that they are learning phrasal verbs much better and to a much more advanced degree and with a much higher level of comfort because I feel more comfortable around the terminology. This book also has at the end a large list of commonly used verbs and divides those verbs into all of the groups
that I've explained so far today. So you will find an appendix which contains separable transitive phrasal verbs, inseparable, permanently separated, intransitive verbs, etc. So that's essentially how that works. They're the recommendations I would do. Coming back to our website, I'm just going to go back briefly. I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk that we would cover the phrasal verbs as they are currently known. Now, when I teach phrasal verbs, I also then start teaching prepositional verbs and prepositional phrasal verbs. And I have colleagues who aren't as happy as me to teach them in this way. But I believe that there is a difference, because as much as I told you here that a phrasal verb contains a particle and not a preposition, in a prepositional verb, you've probably already understood that here it is not a particle, it remains a preposition. And I'm going to show that to you because it's important for students to really understand as they get to higher levels this. Why can we put particle or the preposition in different parts of the sentence in English and we can't in others? So I developed some lessons around prepositional phrasal verbs. I've just come back into our website, and now I will close the classroom and just quickly select one of the prepositional phrasal verbs. So I'll go down here. I'll launch this lesson. Now, I know that some of you who are experienced may not agree with the next few things that I'm about to say, but I'm going to say them anyway. Immediately, one of the first prepositional phrasal verbs I bring up to laugh at, and it's primarily this one, and to comment on, some teachers are aghast that I teach them as multi-word verbs. But the reality is, almost always in English, people are going to want to use a direct object, and they have to have a preposition. You might be asking, why do we need to have it as a multi-word verb? It's because you can change this sentence with a relative clause and say, the politician commented on the disaster, and the disaster on which the politician commented. That might seem a little strange for me to say in spoken English, but it's extremely common to use that structure in academic and written English. And if you do not teach these separately as prepositional verbs, your students will never grasp that. The other thing that you want to remember is that when your students are doing reading in their own time, particularly if they read academic texts, they may well be studying for IELTS and TOEFL in particular, or reading academic journals, they are often going to come across sentences with relative clauses in which the preposition appears at the beginning of the relative clause. And students need to know that there is a difference between how you can use a preposition and a particle in a sentence. So that's the prepositional verbs there. Again, we go through and look at the different ways of using them and the properties. And then finally, I'll come to the last series that we have, which is called prepositional phrasal verbs. I enjoy teaching these because they're actually quite easy. And if I can close the classroom, I will come into the second to last lesson I want to show you, and the last group of prepositional phrasal verbs. All of these are easy for the students to remember because these are the classic one of we always teach to put up with. They always contain one verb and two elements. One verb and two elements. They are not a large group in the language. However, they do appear quite frequently, and these ones do appear quite frequently and mostly in spoken English, which I think is where the stereotype comes from that phrasal verbs are used primarily in spoken English. They do, with this particular group of words, they tend to be a little bit colloquial. You won't find them, generally speaking, in academic English. So that's the last group that I would show you there. I think they're worth teaching separately as a group of verbs. So once you've gone through the grammar, what you really need to be doing then is asking this or helping the student to practice as much as possible. And there are two different schools of thought, or possibly more, about how you start grouping together phrasal verbs. What I do is I feel that because you have prepositional phrasal verbs and you also have intransitive phrasal verbs in which the meaning can be understood almost 90% of the time by the verb itself, I've actually created a series of lessons, and I'll go into the first one with here. I'll just go into break. I'll launch that. So I teach in the lessons using the verb and then the different particles all within one lesson. I will teach the verbs that are used with, the phrasal verbs, prepositional phrasal verbs, and gosh, I've forgotten the tense now myself. Phrasal verbs, prepositional phrasal verbs, and prepositional verbs using the verb break. So I'll go in again, give lots of examples, definition, context, lots of bright images to get the students thinking. I'll introduce breakdown. Then also remember that you have the participial adjectives that can come from these verbs, and we use these a lot. For example, the word makeup in English, which is obviously a noun, actually comes from the verb, the phrasal verb to make up, which we don't actually use in this context very often anymore, but we use the noun a lot. So here, lots of bright images, some nice bright text, get them to start practicing these in context. And then we've also got the standard gap fill activities, scenarios that ask them to read each scenario and then asks them a distinct question and then use the language that you have been taught. And you can go nice and slowly through these. Each lesson that I've developed introduces somewhere between 14 and 18 uses of phrasal verbs that will start with one main verb. So a series on break, a lesson with phrasal verbs on come. Actually, I think there's 4 in that series. Give, let, keep. Anyway, you guys...
Maybe it would be good after this to go back to the library and show all the different lesson structures.
Sure.
Part of your
Sorry, I'll do that now. So that's essentially how I use sorry about that. Let me go back. Okay, so here we are in the library. If you do want to come online and have a look, we've got everything. This is the home page. We don't quite have the search function available for you yet, but that will be operational within a week. We're just doing the final testing. And then underneath, we have the categories, phrasal verbs down here on the left-hand side. Okay, all you need to do is click on the drop-down list and you will see the first 12 lessons that I've got actually cover just, they focus primarily on the grammar in the language. And then once your student is familiar with the different types and grammatical properties of phrasal and multi-word verbs, you can then go on to introducing chunks in a lesson, multi-word verbs with back. Because once a student has come to, is familiar with the grammar, they will probably come back to you and want to look at a particular group. And I think you can mix up certainly the latter lessons in the series by picking and choosing. You don't necessarily need to follow those in order, but I think you do need to introduce phrasal verbs in a very specific way: separable first, then inseparable, then permanently separated, then intransitive, and finally, if you want to, prepositional and phrasal prepositional. So I think that's really it from me, Chris. I've talked a lot. I hope I've covered things, and perhaps there's some requests from...
This time, I want you to match the sentences for me, please. Okay, separable transitive phrasal verbs. We are going to the opera at 8 p.m. And so you need to pick a clean shirt out.
Okay.
I received essays from the class, but 3 students didn't hand one in. Of course, I didn't know the answer to that question, so I just made one up. I cannot remember where he lives, so can you please look up his address?
Now, I want you to look only at this side. In each of these boxes, tell me what is the phrasal verb.
Hand in, pick out, made up, make up. I think
Good. Good. Can you tell me what the direct object is in each of these sentences? So maybe start with the bottom one and we will go up.
Okay. His address.
Got it.
1.
Good.
A clean shirt.
Yes.
1.
Excellent. All right. These are special types of nouns. What kind of noun is it? It's a word.
Pronoun.
Good. All right, they're pronouns. Okay. And what can you tell me about pronouns with separable, transitive phrasal verbs? Where must they go?
Middle of the verb, like phrasal verb.
Excellent. All right, they have to go in the middle between two parts. What are the names of the phrasal verb? The two parts of the phrasal verb?
The verb and I forget.
That's okay. It's the verb and the
particle.
particle.
Okay.
Good. All right, the verb and the particle. So let's go a little bit more. If you look at the second one, what is the particle in the phrasal verb? Now, all of these are separable phrasal verbs. I want you to tell me, in your opinion, is it correct or incorrect? And
okay. Correct. Okay. Tony looked some words up in the thesaurus. Yes.
Correct or incorrect?
It's correct, I think.
Okay.
Tony looked up, yeah. John was jotting down it in his jotting. No, it's nothing. It's because it must go here.
Good. Say it correctly for me. Okay, great. Perfect.
John was jotting it down in his notebook.
Good.
Someone used up all the milk. Yes, I think. Simon made up an excuse. Yes, I think like.
I think you're correct.
Yeah.
That's good. So, I've got a difficult question, but I'm going to give it to you. If you were the teacher and you had to tell somebody why this was wrong.
Because a pronoun must get middle of a phrasal verb.
Beautiful.
End of it.
Okay, excellent. All right, you've got it. Now, Which group? We have been looking at a special group of phrasal verbs. Do you remember what they were called? They were called something, something phrasal verbs. Which word do...
Simple tense, maybe.
Not simple tense. I want you to think we talked about a special word for verbs that take a direct object in English.
And transitive and
Good.
simple transitive.
Not simple. What do we call it when we ayrılmak something?
Separatable. Separatable.
Good. So, try to complete the sentences for me here. And be careful, you may need to change the tense.
Okay. Javer's daughter died 10 years ago. He never get over it. I hired a babysitter to look after the kids tonight. Hire means like kiralamak, rent, kind of. But like, is it kind of rent? Like,
That's exactly what you said. Yep.
but we can't say rent.
We don't rent a person, that's correct.
Eh,
Good question. So what else? Okay, you go on holidays and you fly to London. What might you hire because you don't have it, you're not at home anymore. You go to London but you want to go...
room.
Sorry?
Maybe a hotel room.
Good. And what about if you want to visit other cities but you don't have anything to drive in? So, good. All right. Good.
Okay. Jen says someone is stealing money from the company. We really need to look into it. But I don't understand bump into that much.
Okay.
Can you...
Good. All right. We talked about Mike and Fred. Mike and Fred were walking in the street, and all of a sudden Mike goes, "Oh, hey, hi Fred." Did he mean to see Fred? Did they plan to see each other?
No.
Good. So it happened, it was an accident. Do you agree?
Yes.
All right.
Oh.
So,
like, it's when it's accidental when you hug and see someone you bumped into.
you got it. Let me think about, okay, think about your parents. Sometimes we go to places where there are a lot of people. Maybe an airport is a good place, right? Everyone's going to the airport in a couple of weeks, or many people, and you're going to an airport in a couple of weeks, okay? There are always lots of people in the airport during summer holidays. Is it possible that you could see someone that you didn't plan to see?
See someone you didn't plan to see? Yeah.
Maybe you could see your neighbor. Normally you see your neighbor because they live next door to you, but you might see your neighbor, I don't know, at a cinema, or you might see them at the airport, and we would use this verb to express that you saw them, but you didn't plan to see them.
Oh, okay, I understand.
All right?
Yeah.
So if you're in your house, would you bump into your brother?
No, because we are always seeing each other. Now we don't, like, we know we will see each other.
Okay, it's normal that this happens. It's normal that you see them, all right? But for example, if you were in London and you were walking down Carnaby Street and you saw me.
Oh, yeah, I will be really good, like,
Okay.
I will bump into you.
Okay, you would be happy to bump into me.
Yeah.
That's great. Maybe I have a feeling we will bump into each other this summer.